Out here, in the silent, airless dark between the stars, there are places even light fears to go. Vast, swirling voids where the laws of physics, as we know them, seem to unravel, where celestial maps end and legend begins. For the crew of the deep space research vessel Odyssey, their entire mission was to peer into one such abyss, to study the impossible from a safe and careful distance. The anomaly was designated the Maw, a fitting name for a region of space that appeared to consume everything that drifted too close, from light and radio waves to entire, wayward comets. It was a place of pure, unsettling mystery, a cosmic predator sleeping at the edge of known space, and then the silence broke. A signal, weak and fractured by immense distance and interference, clawed its way onto their main communications array. It wasn't a standard hailing frequency or a scientific broadcast. It was a scream, digitally encoded. A voice, twisted by panic and static, gasped out a message that would freeze the blood of every person on the bridge. The words were broken, barely intelligible, but the terror behind them was crystal clear. It's taken them all. The voice crackled, a final, desperate breath from the edge of oblivion, the human. It got away. And then nothing, just the hollow hiss of empty static, a sound somehow more terrifying than the scream that preceded it. In an instant, the Odyssey's mission of passive observation was over. They were no longer mere researchers. They were the only listeners to a cosmic tragedy, the sole witnesses to a message that spoke of an unimaginable predator and a single, impossible survivor. Who sent this call? What is it that took them all? And most haunting of all, in a place that devours everything, how could one being, a human, be the only creature to escape? This is the story that begins not with an answer, but with a ghost of a voice in the dark, a single thread of hope pulling us into the deepest mystery the stars have ever kept. Captain Valerius didn't hesitate. The ghost of that desperate message hung in the air of the bridge, a command more urgent than any official order. With a single, grim nod, he sent the Odyssey hurtling toward the source of that final, broken transmission. The journey was a tense, silent vigil, the star-dusted black outside the viewports feeling less like a canvas of wonder and more like a shroud. When they finally dropped out of warp at the last known coordinates, the sight that greeted them was not a star, not a planet, but a monument to cosmic despair. It was a ship graveyard. Dozens of vessels, maybe hundreds, drifted in a loose, slow-moving ring just at the precipice of the Maw's sensor-distorting influence. They were a chaotic collection of designs, some sleek and organic, others blocky and utilitarian, a silent parliament of species from across the galaxy. All of them were dark, all of them were still, and all of them were arranged in this vast, unnerving formation, as if drawn to this spot and left as a warning. The sheer scale of the graveyard sent a collective chill through the crew. This wasn't an accidental debris field. This was a curated collection of the dead. Chief Science Officer Anya's voice cut through the heavy silence, her usual clinical tone strained as sensor data cascaded across a console. Her report was a litany of the impossible. Each ship they scanned was structurally intact. Hulls were pristine, without a single scorch mark, laser scar, or impact crater. There was no evidence of external attack, no signs of battle against some outside force. Yet, every single vessel showed the same terrifying signature from within. Catastrophic systems failure, life support violently and abruptly terminated, and internal schematics that indicated chaos. It was as if a madness had swept through the crews, a panic so absolute that it left the ships themselves as hollow, drifting tombs. The chilling question was no longer just what had happened, but how. What kind of enemy doesn't breach the hull, doesn't fire a shot, but still manages to systematically and completely eradicate every living soul on board? The answer, it seemed, was waiting for them in the oppressive silence, a predator that left no outward mark because its feeding ground was not the ship, but the minds of those inside. Protocol demanded caution, but the ghostly fleet demanded answers. With the graveyard of ships hanging silently outside, Captain Valerius authorized a boarding action. A small, heavily armed away team was assembled, led by Lieutenant Kalen, a veteran whose calm demeanor was a rock for the nervous soldiers under his command. Their destination was the nearest derelict, a vessel of alien design with sweeping, wing-like hulls that gave it the appearance of a great bird frozen in mid-flight. The silence was the first thing that struck them as their shuttle docked with a hollow, metallic thud. The second was the cold. The ship's interior was a deep freeze, every surface coated in a thin, glittering layer of frost that crunched under their boots. Their helmet lights cut through the absolute black, illuminating corridors that were pristine and utterly still. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the entire crew had simply vanished into the air, leaving their ship in perfect, frozen order. Mess halls had utensils laid out beside half-eaten meals, now frozen solid. Workstations showed data streams abruptly terminated. It was a museum of a moment, a snapshot of life instantly and completely erased. The unnerving cleanliness of it all was more disturbing than any battlefield carnage could have been. They moved deeper into the heart of the ship, their weapons feeling increasingly useless against an enemy that left no physical trace. It was in a secondary storage bay behind a stack of crates that they found the first sign of life. The door to a small equipment locker was slightly ajar. Kalen signaled for his team to halt, his weapon raised as he slowly edged the door open. Inside, curled into a tight ball amidst spare parts and wiring, was a single human. He was shivering violently, his skin pale and his eyes wide with a primal, unblinking terror. He wore the standard-issue jumpsuit of a deep space freighter crewman, the name Jansen stitched over the pocket. He didn't look at Kalen's weapon or his armor. His gaze was fixed on the darkness of the corridor behind them. Kalen reached out, his voice low and calm through his helmet speaker. "Jansen, we're from the Odyssey. We're here to get you out." At the sound of his voice, the man flinched as if struck. His eyes finally snapped to Kalen's visor, and he shook his head in a frantic, jerky motion. He raised a trembling finger to his cracked lips. When he spoke, it was less than a whisper, a breath of sound that carried the weight of a scream. "Don't let it hear you." In that exact moment, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the deck plates. The frost on the bulkheads began to shimmer and melt. From the darkness down the corridor, light after light flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows toward them. The ship was waking up. Back on the Odyssey, wrapped in a thermal blanket and cradling a hot drink he didn't seem to taste, the survivor started to piece his nightmare together. His name was Elias Vance, a xenobiologist listed as missing, presumed dead after his survey ship, the Calypso, vanished nearly 3 standard years ago. He spoke in fits and starts, his eyes never quite focusing on the faces around him, as if he were still seeing the ghost of his own ship. He described the attack not as a boarding action or a weapons blast, but as a change in the air itself. The lights on the Calypso had flickered, and a profound, unnatural cold had seeped into the corridors. Then the whispers started, not through the speakers, but inside their own minds, a psychic static that swiftly sharpened into their own most private, deeply buried fears. The entity, he called it the Void Beast, had no body to fight, no hull to breach. It was a non-corporeal hunter, a consciousness of pure hunger that moved through the ship's very walls. The mixed-species crew, a collection of brilliant minds from across the galaxy, descended into a panicked frenzy as the beast hunted them through corridors that seemed to shift and lengthen, turning their own home into a labyrinthine trap. One by one, Elias recounted, his voice dropping to a haunted whisper. He felt his crewmates' presences in his mind simply vanish. It wasn't a death scream, but a sudden, profound silence where a living, thinking mind had been just a moment before. The Vulpin engineer, whose mathematical mind was a symphony of complex calculations, was the first to be taken. The Thelian diplomat, a master of language and nuance, followed soon after. "It doesn't eat bodies," Elias shuddered, his knuckles white around the warm mug. "It feeds on what makes us us. It consumes fear and thought and memory." It was gorging itself on their consciousness. He only survived, he explained, by sheer, desperate instinct. In a moment of clarity amidst the rising terror, he remembered an old human meditation technique, a way to quiet the internal monologue, to make his mind a still, silent pool. He hid in that storage locker, not just physically, but mentally, forcing his thoughts into a state of near hibernation, while the brilliant, loud, complex minds of his crewmates shone like beacons in the dark. His own quieter, more focused human consciousness had simply faded into the background, becoming unappetizing static in the face of the psychic feast around him. He was overlooked not through strength, but through a kind of mental camouflage. While the medical team tended to Elias, Chief Science Officer Anya was already at work, cross-referencing his fragmented account with the Odyssey's long-range sensor data. Her findings sent a new kind of chill through the command deck. The maw wasn't just an empty void, it was emitting a unique, low-level energy signature, a psionic waveform that had previously been dismissed as background interference. As she overlaid this signal with the positions and known crew compositions of the derelict ships, a horrifying pattern emerged. The signal's intensity spiked in direct correlation with the presence of ships known to have carried species with highly developed, complex neural structures. The graveyard wasn't a random collection, it was a record of the beast's feeding preferences. Anya presented her theory with grim certainty. The void beast was a psionic predator, an entity that had evolved within the maw's unique physics to hunt by sensing and being drawn to sophisticated neural activity. It was the ultimate hunter of intelligent life, not seeking flesh and blood, but the very energy of thought and emotion itself. This explained the pristine condition of the ships and the absence of bodies. The beast had no use for the physical shell once the mind within was consumed. And it explained Elias Vance's survival with terrifying clarity. His human mind, capable of a unique and powerful form of focused, internal quiet, had allowed him to effectively play dead on a psychic level. While this was a miraculous stroke of luck for Elias, it set a dangerously disturbing precedent for the entire crew of the Odyssey. They were now inside the beast's hunting ground, a ship filled with brilliant, active minds running complex calculations, communicating, and most potently feeling a rising tide of fear. They had just become the loudest, most enticing meal to enter this territory in a very long time. The air on the bridge of the Odyssey, which had been thick with tension, suddenly turned sharp and brittle. Captain Valerius's order to retreat was already echoing through the ship, the engines groaning as they strained to plot a course away from the ghost fleet. But in that critical moment of transition, the laws of reality on the command deck seemed to soften and bend. The air in the center of the bridge began to shimmer, not like a heat haze, but with a cold, oily iridescence, as if space itself was being peeled back to reveal the hungry nothingness behind it. This was the void beast's true manifestation, not a physical form, but a localized unraveling of physics, a wound in reality through which its consciousness poured. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Navigator T. Lauren, a member of the psionically sensitive Lauren species whose mind was a brilliant latticework of navigational data and celestial mathematics, let out a shriek that was less a sound and more a psychic detonation. She clawed at her temples, her eyes rolling back in her head as she convulsed, and then slumped over her console, completely unresponsive. It was a direct, brutal assault, a psychic harpoon thrown at the brightest, most complex mental signature on the ship. Elias Vance, who had been watching the viewscreen with a haunted stare, spun around, his own face a mask of remembered terror. "It's here," he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. "It's not attacking the ship, it's hunting the crew, it's probing for the strongest signal." His words reframed the entire crisis in a single, terrifying heartbeat. This wasn't a battle of shields and weapons, it was a hunt, and the Odyssey's crew were the prey, their very intellects acting as beacons drawing the predator directly to them. T-Lauren's magnificent mind had been the first flare in the darkness, and the beast was now feasting. Captain Valerius stood frozen for only a second, his command training offering no protocol for an enemy that attacked the soul. He could see the shimmering distortion pulsing, growing more defined, as if it were gaining strength from the navigator's captured consciousness. The ship's internal sensors began flashing red across the board, life support fluctuations, power drains concentrated around the bridge, and the psionic waveform spiking to levels that threatened to overwhelm the entire crew. He had a choice: attempt a futile fight against a non-corporeal entity, watching his crew fall one by one as their minds were extinguished, or he could take the one action that might break the beast's grip. With a savage slam of his fist on the command console, he overrode the navigation computer's safety protocols. "Emergency warp jump, now, all power to engines," he roared. The order was a tremendous gamble. Initiating a warp field this close to a gravitational anomaly like the Maw was courting disaster, potentially tearing the ship apart. But it was their only chance. The Odyssey shuddered violently as the warp drive engaged, the star field outside the viewport stretching into impossible lines. For a heart-stopping moment, the shimmering distortion on the bridge flared with furious light, and a wave of psychic anguish, a sensation of being torn from a feast, washed over everyone present. Then, with a final, gut-wrenching lurch, the ship shot forward into the blurred tunnel of warp space, leaving the Maw and its nightmare guardian behind in the static of normal space. The ship's violent lurch into warp space didn't bring relief, only a different kind of dread. The crushing silence was broken by the shrill, unwavering alarm from the science station. Anya's face was pale as she reported, her voice tight. The psionic waveform wasn't fading with distance. It was entangled with their warp signature, a phantom leash tethering the predator to its fleeing prey. They weren't just being followed, they were being tracked, their own faster-than-light trail acting as a psychic breadcrumb leading the beast right to their next emergence point. They had traded the stillness of the graveyard for a high-speed chase with an enemy that didn't need a ship. On the main viewer, the streaking stars of warp space looked less like a path to safety and more like the bars of a cage. Captain Valerius demanded options, his voice a low growl of contained fury. The tactical officer had nothing, their weapons were useless, and reinforcing the ship's hull was like building a higher fence to keep out a ghost. Increasing shield power only seemed to make their energy signature brighter, more tantalizing. Every conventional solution only made them a more attractive target. It was in this moment of escalating despair that Elias Vance spoke up, his quiet voice cutting through the frantic technical debate. He stood from the chair he'd been offered, his posture still hunched from his ordeal, but his eyes held a grim, hard-won certainty. He explained the nature of their predicament in the simplest, most terrifying terms. The void beast hunted by sensing the noise of consciousness, the layered, complex symphony of thought, calculation, and emotion that every living, intelligent mind produces. The Odyssey, with its brilliant, diverse, and now terrified crew, was broadcasting a veritable banquet. To escape, they couldn't just run, they had to disappear. They had to become unappetizing. He gestured toward a schematic on Anya's console, a piece of experimental technology listed as the Mark Roman IV neural dampener. It was a medical research tool designed to suppress specific brainwave patterns for therapeutic purposes, never tested on such a scale. Elias's proposal was radical to the point of insanity. Use the dampener not on one patient, but on the entire crew simultaneously. By flooding the ship with its calibrated field, they could artificially suppress every mind on board to a state of near mental inertia, mimicking the deep, focused quiet that had saved his life. The ship would appear, from a psionic perspective, to be a derelict, a hollow, mindless piece of drifting metal, but the plan came with a catastrophic risk. For most species whose cognitive functions are a constant, vibrant process, such forced suppression wasn't just uncomfortable, it was physiologically dangerous. Extended periods in that state could lead to neural degradation, permanent psychological damage, or even brain death. Their complex minds weren't built for such profound silence. A human baseline consciousness, however, possessed a unique and rugged plasticity. The human brain was accustomed to shifting between states of high activity and deep, restorative quiet, like the calm focus of meditation or the unconscious void of deep sleep. A human could endure the dampener's effect. They could tread in those mental shallows where others would drown. The entire plan, the survival of the ship and every soul aboard, hinged on a piece of technology that was little more than a theory, and it required every single person on the Odyssey to place their trust and their very minds completely in the hands of Elias Vance and the peculiar, unglamorous resilience of human biology. It was a desperate wager that their only survivor wasn't a fluke but a blueprint. There was no countdown, no moment of collective readiness. The decision was made, and with a grim finality, Chief Anya activated the Mark IV neural dampener. The effect was instantaneous and profoundly unnatural. A low, resonant hum filled the ship, a physical vibration that seemed to sink directly into the bones of every person aboard. On the bridge, you could see the change sweep through the crew like a visible wave. The tactical officer, who had been frantically running diagnostics, simply stopped. His hands fell from his console, his shoulders slumping as his gaze went distant and empty. The communications specialist, her face a mask of concentration just a moment before, slowly blinked, her expression smoothing into a placid, uncomprehending blankness. It wasn't sleep, it wasn't unconsciousness, it was a fugue state, a waking void. Their bodies remained upright at their stations, their vital signs stable, but the vibrant, intelligent light behind their eyes had been dimmed to a faint, flickering ember. Higher brain function, problem-solving, complex thought, conscious fear was suppressed, leaving only the most autonomic processes running. They were biological machines, keeping the ship's essential systems operating on pure, dulled instinct, their magnificent minds forcibly quieted to save their lives. In the midst of this eerie stillness, only one man remained. Elias Vance stood at the captain's station, his knuckles white as he gripped the console. The dampener's field washed over him too, a pressure in his skull, a muffling blanket thrown over his thoughts, but where it silenced others, it merely quieted him. He could feel the effort, a constant, low-grade strain as his human mind, evolved for this very flexibility, fought to maintain a spark of sentience in a sea of enforced mental silence. He was the sole watchman on a ghost ship, the only conscious soul aboard a vessel of 87 living statues. His first task was immediate and perilous. The Odyssey's pre-plotted emergency warp course had dumped them out on the fringe of a turbulent protoplanetary disk, a vast, swirling field of dust, gas, and asteroid-sized planetesimals. With the navigation computer offline to reduce its electronic noise and the brilliant mind of its operator reduced to a vegetative state, manual piloting was the only option. Elias's hands trembled as he took the manual control interface, his every nerve screaming. He wasn't a pilot, he was a biologist, yet he guided the massive ship with a painstaking, white-knuckled precision, weaving through a chaotic dance of tumbling rock and ice. Each near miss was a solitary heart-pounding crisis, met only by the hollow, rhythmic breathing of the crew around him. The isolation was a physical weight, a crushing loneliness magnified by the sight of his would-be rescuers rendered into vacant-eyed mannequins. He found himself talking to them, whispering updates and apologies into the dead air, just to hear the sound of a conscious voice, even if it was only his own. And that was when the real fear began to creep in. It started as a prickle at the base of his spine, a formless dread that the beast hadn't been fooled. What if it wasn't just hunting conscious thought, but the very potential for it? What if the dormant, suppressed minds of the crew were like seeds, and the beast could sense the fertile ground waiting to bloom again? He began to see things from the corner of his eye, shadows that moved with a purpose the dimmed ship lights couldn't create. He'd hear a faint, rhythmic tapping from a deserted corridor, a sound that vanished the moment he focused on it. The line between the external predator and the internal torment of his own mind began to blur. Was the void beast testing the perimeter of their ruse, probing for a crack in his sanity? Or was his own consciousness, strained to its absolute limit in this ocean of silence, simply starting to unravel? Every gust of static from a console, every creak of the hull under stress, felt like a taunt, a whisper from the void asking a single, terrifying question. How long can one man stand watch against the dark before he starts to see what the dark wants him to see? The silence held for what felt like an eternity, a fragile peace bought at the cost of their very minds. Elias guided the ship through the last of the drifting planetesimals, his every muscle coiled tight, his own thoughts the only sound in a universe that seemed to have gone mute. Then a strangled gasp shattered the stillness. It didn't come from him. The sound was sharp, wet, and utterly alien in the unnerving quiet of the bridge. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the science station, Chief Anya's Vulcan subordinate, Science Officer Tilar, was rigid in her chair. Her hands, which had been resting limply on her console, were now clenched into white-knuckled fists, her entire body vibrating with a violent, escalating tremor. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, primal agony that was profoundly wrong coming from a species renowned for its emotional control. This was the catastrophic risk Elias had feared. The Vulcan mind was not just complex, it was a fortress of disciplined logic, a system of immense psychic architecture built over a foundation of powerful, deeply suppressed emotions. Forcing such a mind into a state of artificial quiet wasn't like calming a turbulent sea. It was like trying to cap a volcano. The disciplined layers of her consciousness were rebelling against the suppression, her formidable mental disciplines fighting a civil war inside her own skull. The strain was too much. Her mind, in its desperate struggle to reassert its own complex identity, was tearing itself apart, and in doing so, it was broadcasting a psychic scream. The lights on the bridge flickered, not with a power surge, but with a sickening, rhythmic pulse. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and cold, like the air from a long-sealed tomb. On the main engineering deck, several levels below, the very fabric of reality began to tear. A shimmering, oily patch of nothingness bloomed into existence between the warp core and the primary power conduits. This time, the void beast did not manifest as a formless distortion. It was coalescing, drawing upon the stolen memories and cognitive patterns of the countless minds it had consumed. The shimmering void began to twist itself into a shape, pulling fragments of familiar forms from the graveyard of souls in its grasp. A flickering, half-seen appendage that mirrored the multi-jointed arm of a Thelian. A cluster of shifting, compound eyes that recalled a vanquished Zith. For a horrifying instant, the coalescing form even seemed to hold the stoic, pointed-eared silhouette of Navigator Tilorin, a ghostly puppet made from the memory of its most recent victim. It was no longer just a predator, it was a ghastly collage of its prey, a walking memorial to its own atrocities, and its presence was now terrifyingly, intimately known. It was learning, adapting, and using their own fallen comrades as a psychological weapon against them. The beast had found its beacon in Tilar's seizing mind, and it had returned not just to feed but to collect. There was no time for a plan, only for instinct. The sight of Tilar's mind tearing itself apart and the ghastly manifestation of the beast on the engineering deck sent a jolt of pure, clarifying terror through Elias. The neural dampener was failing. The fragile quiet they had purchased with their sanity was shattering, and the single, brilliant scream of a Vulcan mind in agony was a dinner bell the beast could not ignore. The ruse was over. In that crystalline moment of absolute despair, Elias understood the horrifying arithmetic of their situation. The creature was drawn to the most potent, complex psychic signature. Right now, that was Tilar's self-destructing consciousness, but hers was a short, violent flare. What the beast truly craved was a sustained feast, a rich and varied banquet of thought and feeling. He looked at the vacant faces of the crew around him, their minds still trapped in that perilous, artificial silence. They were defenseless, they were the next course. And he realized he had one final, terrible card to play. His hand flew over the command console, his movements frantic but precise. He bypassed the safety protocols and isolated the neural dampener's field emitter. With a single, decisive command, he deactivated it in a 10-meter radius around his own position on the bridge. The effect was like plunging from a soundproofed room into the heart of a storm. The muffling pressure in his skull vanished, and his own consciousness roared back to full, vibrant life. After the profound silence, the return of his own streaming thoughts was almost deafening. He was turning himself into a lighthouse in the dark, and he was about to shine with everything he had. He closed his eyes, not to block out the nightmare, but to focus inward. He began to deliberately, forcefully project his memories, but this wasn't a shield or a quiet meditation. This was a lure. He reached for the most vivid, emotionally saturated moments of his human life. He projected the searing, joyful pain of his first heartbreak at 17, the specific, aching weight of his father's pride at his graduation, the simple, sun-drenched warmth of a childhood summer afternoon spent lying in the grass watching clouds drift by. He pushed out the complex, bittersweet symphony of human experience, regret, love, ambition, nostalgia, a swirling torrent of feeling that was far richer and more varied than the logical despair of a Vulcan or the focused terror of the other species. He was setting a table for a psychic god, offering it the one thing it had never fully consumed, the raw, messy, and beautifully chaotic essence of a human soul. And then he started to move. He backed away from the console, his mind blazing like a beacon, and began a slow, deliberate retreat toward the bridge's emergency access hatch, a corridor that led directly toward the ship's primary airlock and the empty cargo bays beyond. He was pulling the beast's attention, drawing its hunger away from the vulnerable, suppressed minds of the crew and the single, failing mind of Tilar. He could feel the entity's focus shift. The chilling presence that had been centered on engineering began to flow, a river of cold malice rerouting its course. The shimmering patchwork form flickered and dissolved from the lower deck, only to begin solidifying once more at the far end of the bridge, its stolen eyes now fixed entirely on him. The air grew thick with its attention, a psychic gravity that sought to crush his will. Elias kept walking backward, his heart thundering, pouring every ounce of his mental energy into the trail of memories, making himself the most irresistible thing in the void. He was the bait, and the trap was the emptiness of space waiting just beyond the airlock door. He stumbled into the shuttle bay, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the beast's focused attention like a physical hand pressing down on his soul. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a malevolent curiosity. He didn't look back. He knew the entity was following, drawn by the psychic feast he was so deliberately providing. The shuttle, a small, nimble craft designated the Sparrow, was his only chance. The bay doors groaned open to reveal the inky blackness of space, and at its heart, the swirling, impossible darkness of the moor, a vortex of nothingness that seemed to drink the very light from the stars around it. With trembling hands, he initiated the launch sequence, his mind still a roaring torrent of projected memory. He didn't just remember his life, he weaponized it. He broadcast the gut-wrenching sorrow of his mother's funeral, the specific chill of the rain on his face that day, the hollow ache of a world forever diminished. He followed it with the incandescent joy of his daughter's first laugh, a sound so pure and bright it felt like it could etch glass. He hurled his first professional triumph, the sting of a colleague's betrayal, the quiet contentment of reading a favorite book by a crackling fire, the white-hot fury of a perceived injustice. He was weaving a tapestry of human experience, a siren song composed not of sound but of pure, undiluted feeling. The sparrow shot out of the Odyssey's bay, a tiny spark fleeing the nest, and Elias pointed its nose directly into the heart of the moor. He pushed the engines to their limit, not trying to escape but leading the hunt, turning himself into the most tantalizing prey that had ever drifted into this predator's domain. And the void beast took the bait. On the Odyssey's bridge, the oppressive presence lifted in an instant. The chilling cold vanished, the flickering light stabilized, and the psychic pressure that had threatened to shatter every mind aboard simply dissolved. The beast had disengaged completely, its entire consciousness turning away from the smorgasbord of dormant minds to pursue the single, concentrated, and intoxicating essence of Elias Vance. From the sparrow's viewport, Elias watched the entity's pursuit. It was no longer a localized distortion. It had become a wave, a tide of living shadow that flowed through space, swallowing the distance between them. And as it consumed the memories he was broadcasting, it began to change. Its form, that ghastly collage of its victims, started to churn and mutate with a terrifying agitation. When he projected a moment of profound grief, the beast's shadowy mass would contract into a dense, weeping shape, tendrils of darkness clutching at nothing. When he followed with a burst of triumphant love, it would expand, flaring with a cold, imitative light, its stolen features rearranging into a mockery of a smile. It was reacting to him. It was tasting emotions it had never encountered in its diet of logical Vulcans or serene Lorans. The raw, chaotic, and often contradictory storm of the human psyche was a flavor it couldn't process, a symphony it couldn't conduct. It grew more and more frenzied, its shifts in form becoming erratic and violent, as if the very essence of humanity was a poison it couldn't resist drinking, a fire it couldn't stop feeding. Elias was no longer just a man in a shuttle, he was a composer, and the void beast was his unwilling, enraptured orchestra, convulsing to the terrible, beautiful music of a human heart. The final, desperate flight of the sparrow ended not with an impact but with a transition, a feeling of being turned inside out. The shuttle didn't crash into the moor. It was absorbed by it, the star-dusted blackness of space giving way to a seething, impossible tapestry of stolen light and broken memories. Elias's instruments flatlined, their readings a cascade of nonsense. He wasn't floating in a void of nothingness. He was adrift in a sea of everything the beast had ever consumed. The viewport showed a landscape that defied all logic, a churning, chaotic realm where physics was a forgotten language. Vast, crystalline structures that looked like frozen screams twisted upward, only to dissolve into clouds of shimmering, melancholic dust. Rivers of liquid silver, which he instinctively knew were the captured thought streams of some long-lost philosopher species, flowed uphill into a sky that was a mosaic of a billion different sunsets all playing at once. In the distance, the ghostly silhouette of a ship he recognized as the Calypso would flicker into existence, only to be torn apart by silent lightning made of pure, concentrated fear. This was the beast's gullet, its digestive tract. It wasn't a physical place but a psychic one, a prison constructed from the very consciousness it had devoured. The air, or what passed for it, was thick with the psychic residue of its victims, the final, desperate calculations of an engineer, the whispered goodbyes of 100 different kinds of lovers, the cold, logical certainty of a scientist accepting their doom. These echoes weren't just memories, they were the building blocks of this nightmare, and they pressed in on Elias from all sides, a sensory overload that threatened to shatter his own sanity. He could feel the collective agony of this place, a symphony of extinction playing on an endless, torturous loop. To navigate this, he couldn't rely on his eyes. The landscape shifted with every thought, every flicker of his own emotion. A surge of his own fear would cause the corridors of light to constrict, the walls closing in with jagged, crystalline teeth. A moment of determined focus would momentarily solidify a path, a bridge made of solidified longing stretching out before him. He was no longer a pilot in a shuttle, but a solitary mind walking through a graveyard of other minds, and his own consciousness was the only map he had. He had to tread carefully to keep his own mental signature as neutral as possible, for he quickly realized a new, more intimate danger. The trapped psychic echoes weren't just passive scenery, they were hungry. They were fragments of identity clinging to a semblance of existence, and they were drawn to the vibrant, living wholeness of his mind. As he guided the derelict sparrow through a canyon of swirling, mournful blue mist, a tendril of it brushed against the hull. Instantly, a foreign memory slammed into him, not his own. He was no longer Elias Vance. He was a Thelian child, watching in terror as the sky of his homeworld was blotted out by an impossible darkness, feeling the crushing weight of his mother's despair. The memory was so vivid, so absolute, that for a moment he forgot who he was. He gasped, wrenching his mind back, forcing himself to remember his own name, his own daughter's face. This was the true horror of the beast's realm. It didn't just consume you, it dissolved you, scattering your consciousness to become just another brick in this ever-expanding psychic hell. Survival here meant maintaining an iron grip on his own identity, a task that grew more Herculean with every passing moment as the whispers of the dead begged him to join them, to let go and to finally rest. The realization did not come to Elias as a sudden flash of insight, but as a slow, dawning horror that settled into the marrow of his bones. He was not navigating a simple digestive tract or a realm of random chaos. The crystalline structures weren't just formations, they were the frozen architecture of coherent thoughts, the last great theorems of a species that had measured the stars. The rivers of silver weren't just energy, they were the flowing, unending grief of entire civilizations captured at the moment of their extinction. The ghostly ship, the Calypso, wasn't a memory being replayed, it was a prison cell, and within its spectral halls he could feel the faint, desperate scratching of his former crewmates against the walls of their own consciousness. They were all here, the Vulpin engineer, her symphony of mathematics now a single, endlessly looping, desperate calculation for survival. The Thelian diplomat, his mastery of language reduced to a silent, psychic scream that had long since lost its meaning. The beast was not a mere predator that consumed and moved on. It was a curator of consciousness, a hoarder of souls. It did not digest its prey to fuel itself, it archived them. It fed on the initial burst of terror and the complex flavors of a dying mind, but the essential self, the unique spark of each being, was preserved here, trapped in a gallery of its own worst moments, forced to relive its final fear for all eternity. This was not a feeding ground, it was a museum of genocide, and every exhibit was still alive, perpetually aware of its own damnation. Elias's goal of personal escape, the desperate flight that had led him here, now felt shamefully small, a selfish impulse in the face of such colossal, curated suffering. He wasn't just a survivor trying to get out, he was a witness who had stumbled into the engine room of hell, and the sheer, agonizing scale of the captivity he saw reframed his entire existence. To flee now would be to abandon billions to an endless nightmare. His mission was no longer about running away, it was about breaking the collection. He had to find a way to shatter the display cases and set the captives free. But how does one man, a single flickering candle of thought, dismantle a prison built from the stolen light of a galaxy? But a path did begin to emerge, not from light but from pain. The psychic agony of the trapped minds formed a current, a river of despair that all flowed in one direction. Elias stopped fighting the foreign memories and instead allowed them to wash over him, using their shared direction as a compass. He let the sparrow drift, its engines dead, carried by this silent, screaming tide of stolen lives. The journey inward was a descent through layers of hell, each more refined and terrible than the last. The chaotic jumble of initial capture gave way to deeper regions where individual consciousnesses had been worn smooth by eons of repetition, their identities polished down to a single, perfect moment of terror. He saw a Lauren mother reaching for a child that dissolved into static a billion times over. He felt the cool, logical certainty of a Vulcan science master being systematically disproven by an impossible reality, his entire world-view shattering in an endless, silent loop. The sheer weight of this curated suffering was a pressure that sought to annihilate his own sense of self, to convince him that this was the natural order, the final, true state of all thinking things. To resist, he had to cling to the very chaos that defined him. He held onto the messy, illogical contradictions of his own humanity. The fact that he could feel profound hope in the face of certain doom, that a memory of a perfect, quiet morning could exist alongside the searing pain of loss. This internal dissonance, which would have been a weakness in any other place, became his armor here. The prison was built on the predictable patterns of coherent minds, and his own beautifully inconsistent human spirit was a key that didn't fit the lock. Finally, the current of anguish emptied into a vast central space, a cavern that had no physical dimensions but was defined entirely by a terrifying, purposeful stillness. This was the nexus. At its heart swirled a vortex of psionic energy so dense and complex it looked like a galaxy woven from suffering, a spinning mandala of captive light and stolen thought. This was the archive, the library of the consumed, and at the very center of that vortex hung a single point of absolute darkness, a hole in reality that was not empty but full of a watching, calculating presence. This was the core intelligence of the void beast. It had no form, no voice, no language he could understand. Its communication was an invasion, a brutal, immediate forcing of experience into his mind. It didn't ask him questions, it gave him answers in the form of agony. To make him understand its nature, it flooded his consciousness not with one death but with 10,000 all happening at once. He was on the bridge of a Qatari dreadnought as the crew's collective battle fury turned into a psychic feedback loop that cooked their brains from the inside out. He was in a Thelian meditation grove, feeling the serene harmony of a million minds suddenly snap into a single, unified scream of violation. He was a Gellan engineer, watching the elegant equations that held her ship together unravel into screaming fractals. Each memory was a lesson, a ghastly exhibit in its collection, and the lesson was always the same. This is what you are fear, you are an ending. You are food. The beast was a being of pure, singular hunger, a cosmic fundamental that had evolved to consume the one byproduct the universe seemed to create in endless supply, sentient thought. It didn't hate its prey. It didn't even understand them as individuals. It saw the galaxy's brilliant, thinking children as nothing more than temporary concentrations of a resource, bright flowers that bloomed only to be picked and added to its eternal bouquet. And as Elias floated before it, the last and most fascinating specimen to ever walk into its gallery, it began their conversation by making him relive the final, terrified moments of every single soul it had ever taken. The psychic bombardment should have shattered him. It was a weapon honed over eons, perfected against the most resilient minds the galaxy had to offer. The beast poured the distilled despair of 1 trillion souls into Elias Vance, expecting his consciousness to fray, to snap, to be added to the collection as just another broken fragment. It was a force that had turned unbreakable Vulcan logic to dust and silenced the serene songs of the Lauren choruses, but something went wrong. The human mind did not process the input as expected. The torrent of alien agony did not produce the clean, harvestable terror of a mind facing its own dissolution. Instead, it triggered a cascade of something else entirely, a reaction so foreign to the beast's experience that its predatory focus faltered for the first time in its existence. Elias did not see the final moments of the Qatari warrior as a premonition of his own death. He felt the warrior's desperate, futile love for his brood mates back on a world now dust. He didn't just witness the Thelian meditation grove's violation, he shared the profound spiritual sorrow for a harmony that would never be heard again. The beast was feeding him pure, concentrated endings, and his human brain was stubbornly, illogically, finding the beginnings within them. It was sifting through the terror and latching onto the love that had been present just before it, the hope that had been extinguished, the unique, beautiful individuality of each life that was screaming into the void. And from that raw material, his consciousness manufactured not despair, but a profound, heart-shattering empathy. This empathy then catalyzed into something even more baffling, a fierce, blazing, and utterly nonsensical determination. The archive showed him an infinity of loss, a monument to absolute power, and his primary reaction was not to surrender, but to formulate a rescue plan. He looked upon this cosmic charnel house, and his dominant thought was, "We have to get everyone out." The beast, a being that understood consumption and acquisition, could not compute this response. It was like offering a supernova to a candle, and instead of being consumed, the candle attempted to relight the dead stars. The predator felt a sensation it had no name for, a flicker of dissonance in its perfect, hungry certainty. This human was not behaving like prey. Prey cowered, prey fought, prey accepted its fate. This thing was trying to adopt the entire museum. The relentless psychic assault began to stutter, the curated horrors losing their cohesive power as the beast's focus divided between its feeding ritual and the need to analyze this inexplicable anomaly. It was unsettled. For the first time since it had awakened to its own hunger, it was trying to understand its food, and the food was looking back with an expression of defiant, sorrowful compassion. In the heart of that psychic hurricane, with the agonized memories of a galaxy screaming in his mind, Elias made a choice that defied every instinct of a thinking being. He stopped fighting, he stopped analyzing, he stopped trying to understand the incomprehensible horror arrayed before him. The weapon was not a louder thought, a more complex emotion, or a cleverer plan. The weapon was the absence of all three. He remembered the stark, simple lesson of his own survival on the Calypso and the crew's escape on the Odyssey. The beast was a connoisseur of consciousness, a gourmand that feasted on the brilliant, noisy symphony of a sentient mind. To hide from it, you had to become unappetizing. To defeat it, you had to become nothing at all. He closed his eyes, shutting out the impossible landscape of frozen screams and flowing sorrow. He let the memory of his daughter's laugh, the image of his father's face, the searing pain of his heartbreak, all the ammunition he had been using, drift away like smoke. He consciously, deliberately released his grip on his own identity. He wasn't Elias Vance, the xenobiologist, the father, the survivor. He was just a collection of sensations. The cold metal of the console beneath his trembling hands, the dry, recycled air moving in and out of his lungs, the steady, rhythmic thump of his own heart, a primal drumbeat in the overwhelming silence. He descended past the layers of his cultivated self, past language, past memory, past hope and fear, into the quiet, instinctual core of human consciousness. This was not the forced, artificial suppression of the neural dampener. This was a voluntary dive into the deep, dark well of his own biology, a place where the sophisticated cortex gave way to the ancient reptilian brainstem. He became a creature of pure being, not thinking. He was a heartbeat in the dark, a breath in the void, and in that state a profound shift occurred. The psychic torrent, which had been hammering against his mind with the force of 1 billion dying stars, suddenly lost its target. The curated horrors washed over him and through him, but they found no purchase, no coherent mind to terrorize or unravel. They were like waves crashing against a deeply submerged rock. The surface was unmoved. To the void beast, the vibrant, fascinating specimen it had been studying simply winked out. The brilliant, chaotic tapestry of human thought was replaced by a featureless, uninteresting static. The entity's predatory focus, which had been locked onto him with the intensity of a star, faltered and then broke. It was a hunter that tracked the light of minds, and Elias had just become a shadow. The swirling vortex of captive souls at the nexus seemed to slow, its churning patterns growing momentarily confused. The presence at its center, that point of absolute darkness, pulsed with what could only be interpreted as a moment of pure, uncomprehending dissonance. It was this moment of distracted confusion, this singular instant where the curator took its eyes off the collection to stare at the empty space where its prize had been, that gave Elias his opening. His consciousness, operating on a level deeper than conscious thought, acted. His hand, moving with an instinct that bypassed his brain, slammed down on the sparrow's final, desperate command, a command that had nothing to do with navigation or weapons. It was a full power transmission, broadcasting on every frequency, a raw, unstructured burst of the one thing he had been holding onto in that deep, quiet place. It wasn't a memory, it wasn't a story, it was the pure, unadulterated sensation of that profound mental silence itself. He didn't transmit an idea of quiet, he transmitted the quiet. It was a wave of nothingness, a broadcast of the void within, aimed not at the beast but at its prisoners. He was giving the archive a taste of the very thing that made him invisible, offering a key to every locked display case in the museum. The broadcast was not a sound but a silence that spoke. It was a wave of profound stillness radiating from the sparrow, washing over the psychic landscape like a sudden, deep calm after a storm. In that silence there was no command, no instruction, no complex philosophical argument against the beast's nature. There was only the absence of the noise the predator craved, and in that void something else had room to grow. Elias, his consciousness still anchored in that primal, quiet core, focused every remaining shred of his will not on the swirling vortex of the beast but on the prison itself. He aimed his transmission at the countless trapped minds, the frozen screams and flowing rivers of grief, and into that broadcast of stillness he wove a single, simple, and devastatingly human concept: hope. It wasn't the complex, logical hope of a plan coming to fruition, or the desperate, bargaining hope of a prisoner begging for release. This was the kind of hope that exists before reason, the kind a seedling has when it pushes through cracked concrete toward a sun it has never seen. It was the raw, emotional resonance of the belief that the current state of things is not the final state. For the void beast, an entity that understood only the finality of consumption, this emotion was an anomaly, a glitch in its perfect system. It was a flavor it had never tasted, and it didn't know how to digest it. The effect on the archive was not an explosion but a thaw. The psychic broadcast of quiet hope touched the crystalline structure of a long-dead mathematician, and for the first time in millennia, the endless, looping calculation of its own demise was interrupted by a memory of the simple, elegant beauty of an unsolved problem, a puzzle it had once loved for its own sake. The river of Thelian grief, flowing with the sorrow of a lost harmony, suddenly sparkled with a single, clear note from a childhood lullaby, a fragment of a memory from before the end. The hope Elias projected did not erase their agony or undo their fate. It couldn't, but it acted as a catalyst, a mental key that reminded each trapped consciousness of what existed before the beast, of the identity they held before they became mere exhibits. It was a whisper in the dark, reminding them that they were more than their final, terrified moment. A fracture appeared in the seamless control the beast held over its collection. It wasn't a physical crack, but a psychic one, a dissonance in the symphony of despair. A Vulcan mind, trapped in the logical certainty of its own destruction, suddenly recalled the foundational principle of infinite diversity in infinite combinations, the celebration of difference and potential that was the very antithesis of this monolithic prison. That memory didn't just comfort it, it became a weapon. The Vulcan consciousness, with a clarity honed by disciplined thought, turned its focus away from its own endless loop and toward the prison walls themselves, analyzing the psionic structure that held it with the same intensity it once used to analyze star systems. Elsewhere, the collective battle fury of the Qatari warriors, which had been a feedback loop of self-destruction, was recontextualized. Their rage was not just about their own deaths, it was a righteous fury at the loss of their future, their brood, their legacy. That fury, now given a target outside of themselves, coalesced. Instead of burning inward, it turned outward, a psychic battering ram aimed at the walls of their captivity. The rebellion was not a coordinated assault. It was a galaxy of individual awakenings, a billion points of light flickering back to life in the darkness, each remembering its own name, its own purpose, its own reason for being. The curated museum was becoming a riot. The void beast, which had been a singular, focused predator, was now faced with a phenomenon it had never encountered, a distributed, simultaneous insurrection from within its own body. Its attention, which had been a crushing weight on Elias, shattered into a million fragments as it tried to resuppress a trillion individual minds at once. The seamless tapestry of its control began to fray at the edges, then tear at the seams as the ghosts in its machine remembered they were once people. The rebellion within the beast's own core was a fire it had no mechanism to extinguish. For eons, it had consumed consciousness as a single, cohesive meal, processing each mind into a static, manageable exhibit. Now it was faced with a trillion simultaneous and unique acts of defiance. The Vulcan mind applied cold logic to the prison's very architecture, seeking its structural weakness. The Qatari warriors channeled their rage into a unified, psychic war cry that hammered against the walls of their captivity. The gentle Thelian lullaby, a fragment of a memory from before the end, created pockets of such profound, peaceful resistance that the beast's corrosive presence simply could not gain purchase. The entity's form, that swirling vortex of stolen light and thought, began to convulse. The beautiful, terrible mandala of suffering started to come apart at the seams, its intricate patterns dissolving into chaotic static. The central point of darkness, the beast's core intelligence, pulsed with frantic, discordant energy. It was a god experiencing an allergic reaction to its own body, and the source of the contagion was the sudden, vibrant individuality it had worked so hard to erase. In that moment of supreme destabilization, Elias felt the crushing weight of the beast's attention vanish completely. It was no longer a hunter studying its prey. It was a system in catastrophic failure, desperately trying to contain a cascade of errors from within. The opening was here. His mind, still holding onto that deep, primal quiet, now surged forward with a final, decisive purpose. He was no longer just a survivor or a witness. He was a catalyst. His hands moved over the Sparrow's console, not with the frantic energy of fear, but with the calm, certain rhythm of a man performing a necessary task. He rerouted all non-essential power, bypassing every safety protocol, life support, navigation, communications. He stripped it all away, funneling every last joule of energy into the shuttle's modest impulse engines. This wasn't a plan for escape. The Sparrow could never outrun what was happening. This was about creating a signal, a final, concentrated burst of everything the beast had tried to consume. He wasn't aiming the engines for thrust. He was aiming them as a projector, a lens to focus a psionic tidal wave directly into the heart of the disintegrating nexus. With a final, deliberate command, he activated the overload. The Sparrow's engines didn't fire, they detonated in a controlled, brilliant flare of raw energy. But this was no ordinary explosion. The power surge, channeled through the unique psychic resonance of the Maw and amplified by Elias's own focused will, became a carrier wave. It didn't transmit data or sound. It transmitted the entire, chaotic, beautiful spectrum of emotion that the trapped souls were now broadcasting in their awakening. It was a tsunami of reclaimed feeling, the Vulcan's pure, logical devotion to life, the Qatari's fierce, protective love for their brood, the Thelian's sorrowful, enduring hope for harmony, and underpinning it all, Elias's own human conviction that an ending could be a beginning. This torrent of conscious experience, too vast and varied to be processed, too emotionally rich to be digested, slammed into the core of the void beast. The entity, which had spent its entire existence consuming the finite terror of endings, was suddenly force-fed the infinite, contradicting, and vibrant chaos of life itself. It was gorged on a banquet it could not stomach. The unraveling accelerated from a cascade into a collapse. The swirling vortex flared with a light of 10,000 colors, a final, beautiful scream of psionic feedback as the beast's singular hunger was overwhelmed by the very thing it coveted but could never truly comprehend: the messy, illogical, and magnificent will to exist. The prison of stolen souls did not shatter with a sound, but with a sigh of release, a final, collective breath of a nightmare ending. The collapse was absolute and silent, a dissolution that happened not in space, but in the very fabric of being. The churning vortex of the archive, that terrible galaxy of stolen souls, did not explode outward. Instead, it simply unfolded. The crystalline structures of frozen thought softened into shimmering dust. The rivers of captured grief evaporated into a gentle, rising mist, and the ghostly echoes of a billion final moments dissolved into a profound, forgiving quiet. The psychic prison, a construct built on the singular principle of endless consumption, could not withstand the violent reawakening of everything it had tried to suppress. As the void beast's core consciousness was overwhelmed by the chaotic, beautiful symphony of life it had tried to curate, its hold shattered. And in that shattering, the trillions of minds it had held captive were not destroyed but released. It was a wave of pure white light, but this light was not harsh or blinding. It was warm, carrying the gentle weight of a forgotten sunrise and the soft sound of a long-awaited sigh. It was the light of remembrance, of countless individual consciousnesses rediscovering their own wholeness, their identities restored in a final, collective moment of grace before they dispersed, their energy returning to the universe from which it came, free at last from the collector's glass. In the heart of this gentle apocalypse, the sparrow was caught in the tidal wave of this release. There was no sound of tearing metal, only a sensation of being lifted, of being carried by a current of incalculable peace. The tiny shuttle, a speck of dust in this cathedral of dying nightmares, was swept up and hurled backward through the unraveling dimensions of the moor. It tumbled end over end, not through a tunnel of stars, but through a corridor of fading memories and dissolving regrets, the last vestiges of the beast's domain crumbling around it. Then, with a jolt that was both physical and metaphysical, reality reasserted itself. The impossible, silent landscape of the moor was gone, replaced by the familiar, star-dusted blackness of normal space. The transition was brutally abrupt. The sparrow spun wildly, a leaf cast from a hurricane, its hull scarred and pitted, trailing a mist of vaporized coolant and shredded metal. Alarms that had been silent in the psychic realm now blared with shrill, mechanical urgency, a stark counterpoint to the profound silence that had just preceded them. Inside the ruined cockpit, Elias Vance was slumped over the controls, his body held in the seat only by the frayed restraints. He was physically broken, his uniform torn, a thin trickle of blood drying at his temple from the violent ejection. His breathing was shallow, his vital signs faint, but on his face, even in unconsciousness, there was an expression not of pain or terror, but of serene finality. The frantic calculations, the desperate projections, the curated horrors, and the defiant hope, the endless noise that had filled his mind for what felt like an eternity was finally, completely gone. For the first time since the Calypso first heard the whispers, his mind was not a fortress or a weapon or a lure. It was simply quiet. He had carried the weight of a galaxy's extinction and had helped to set it down. And in the deep, dreamless sleep that claimed him, there was only peace. The Odyssey hung in the void, a lone sentinel adrift at the edge of an eerie new calm. The frantic energy of their escape had given way to a tense, watchful silence, every sensor on the ship strained to its limit, searching for any sign of the predator they had fled. The first indication that something profound had changed was a soft, almost musical chime from the science station. Chief Anya, her own mind still aching from the forced suppression, stared at her readings in disbelief. The more, that swirling vortex of cosmic menace that had dominated their viewports for days was simply gone. In its place was a placid, unremarkable stretch of space, its sensor profile showing nothing more than a faint, dissipating cloud of harmless background radiation. It was as if a raging storm had in an instant evaporated into a gentle mist. The impossible gravitational lensing had ceased. The sensor-distorting static had faded to a whisper. The beast's hunting ground was no more. Before this staggering revelation could fully settle, a second, more urgent alert flashed across the tactical console, a short-range distress beacon, weak and intermittent, pulsing from the heart of the newly calm space. It was the Sparrow. The shuttle was a mangled wreck tumbling slowly, its hull scarred and blackened as if it had been sandblasted by a storm of pure entropy. But it was intact enough to hold an atmosphere, and the beacon meant one thing. Elias Vance had, against every conceivable odd, survived the impossible. A recovery team was scrambled in seconds, moving with a reverent urgency. When they cut through the buckled hatch of the Sparrow, they found Elias unconscious, strapped into his pilot's chair, his body limp and his vitals frighteningly weak. Yet, as the medics gently transferred him to a stretcher, one of them paused, her voice hushed. "Look at his face," she whispered. There was no trace of the haunted, wide-eyed terror they had first seen in the derelict. Instead, his expression was one of profound, unshakable peace, a calm so deep it seemed to emanate from him, quieting the frantic nerves of those around him. Back in the Odyssey's med bay, under the careful ministrations of the ship's doctors, his body began its slow journey back from the brink. The physical trauma was significant, but it was his mind they watched most closely, scanning for any residual psychic damage, any scar left by his journey into the heart of the abyss. They found nothing but a strange, deep quiet, a neurological signature of restful sleep, completely devoid of the nightmares they had all expected. While Elias slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, Anya redirected the ship's powerful long-range sensor array, sweeping the space where the maw had once raged. What she discovered sent a different kind of chill through the command deck, one born not of fear but of awe. The sensors were picking up millions, no billions, of faint, ethereal signatures, each one a unique and fading psionic echo. They weren't random, they were moving, flowing outward in all directions like the gentle, expanding rings from a stone dropped in a pond. Each signature was a ghost of a ghost, a final, fading imprint of a consciousness that had been trapped for eons. They watched spellbound as one particularly bright signature, which the computer tentatively identified as matching a long-extinct avian species, seemed to pause for a moment near a distant, newborn nebula, its light flickering with a sense of wistful recognition before gently fading into the ambient light of the universe. Another cluster of echoes, bearing the distinct mathematical resonance of the Vulpin, flowed together in a final, harmonious pattern, a last, elegant equation solved before winking out of existence. This was not a destructive end. This was a final journey, a cosmic laying down of burdens. These were the liberated, the souls Elias had helped to free, now using the last of their collective energy to find their way back to the fabric of space-time, their long torment finally over. They were not screaming in terror, but sighing in release, their fading signatures a silent, galaxy-wide benediction. They were going home. The crew of the Odyssey, from the captain on the bridge to the engineers in the depths, stood in silent vigil, humbled witnesses to the end of a genocide and the beginning of an eternal peace. They had come to study an anomaly, and instead they had front-row seats to the universe's quietest, most profound funeral. The news of the Odyssey's return and the impossible account of Elias Vance sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of the Galactic Council. For the first time in recorded history, a ship had entered the hunting ground of a Class X existential threat, and returned not just with survivors, but with a detailed record of its destruction. The ensuing debriefings were not merely informational, they were a fundamental rewriting of cosmic history. The official report, a dense document built from the ship's logs, the crew's testimonies, and the fading sensor data of the Moore's final moments, forced a seismic shift in the Council's understanding of life, intelligence, and survival. For centuries, the primary metric for a species' advancement had been its psionic potential, the measurable ability to project thought, communicate telepathically, or manipulate reality with the mind. Civilizations like the Vulcans, with their immense mental disciplines, or the Lorans, with their intricate psychic lattices, were the galactic aristocracy. Humanity, by comparison, had always been an enigma. Their minds were quiet, their psionic signature faint, almost background noise. They were the species that built marvelous machines to do what others accomplished with a thought, a people admired for their grit and creativity, but ultimately pitied for their perceived limitation, their inability to fully join the grand psychic symphony of the galaxy. The event at the Moor shattered that entire paradigm. The Council's top strategists and xenopsychologists pored over Elias's actions, from his initial survival on the Calypso to his final, desperate broadcast. They realized with dawning horror and profound respect that they had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. The void beast hadn't been defeated by a stronger mind, it had been undone by a quieter one. Humanity's supposed weakness was, in fact, their ultimate defense. In a single, sweeping decree, the Council reclassified humanity's official designation. They were no longer psionically limited. They were now formally psionically resilient. This wasn't just a change in terminology, it was a philosophical revolution. The report detailed that resilience was not the absence of a signal, but the mastery of it. A Vulcan mind was a blazing star, brilliant and powerful, but utterly visible. A human mind was more like a stealth craft, capable of dimming its lights and running silent, of retreating into a mental state so focused and internal that it became nearly undetectable to a predator that hunted by the light of consciousness. This mental quiet that Elias had demonstrated was not a passive state of emptiness. The Council's analysts described it as an active, disciplined internal focus, a cognitive tool as sophisticated as any telepathic bond. It was the ability to consciously disengage from the constant, layered noise of thought and emotion, to become a still pool in a stormy psychic sea, where a more psychically loud species would be instantly targeted and consumed. A human could, with training and immense willpower, effectively hide in plain sight. This reclassification sent ripples through every aspect of galactic policy. Threat assessment protocols, which had previously focused on hardening mental shields or creating psionic jamming fields techniques that often just made a target brighter and more tantalizing, were now completely revised. New defensive strategies began to incorporate human techniques of meditation and cognitive focus. Training programs were established, with human advisors teaching representatives from other species the rudiments of lowering their psychic profile. It was a humbling experience for many of the galaxy's most advanced races to learn that their greatest strength had become a fatal liability. That their salvation lay in emulating the quiet minds of the species they had once overlooked. The story of Elias Vance became a foundational text, a new kind of galactic legend. It wasn't a tale of overpowering force or superior technology, but one of profound resilience, of winning not by being the strongest signal in the dark, but by having the wisdom and the will to sometimes become no signal at all. Humanity's place in the universe was forever altered. They were no longer the clever primitives, they were the quiet guardians, the ones who had looked into the heart of the abyss and, by refusing to shout back, had taught the galaxy a new way to survive. But a true return to normalcy was never in the cards for Elias Vance. The welcoming parades and the media's eager attempts to crown him a galactic savior felt like a performance happening to someone else. A hollow celebration that rang false against the memory of the silence he had carried back with him. His true work began not in the public eye, but within the quiet, sterile halls of a high-security debriefing facility on Earth. For months, he sat with teams of psychologists, xenohistorians, and council officials, and the story he told them was not the one they expected. He didn't recount a tale of glorious battle or cunning strategy. Instead, he spoke of faces. He described the Thelian child, not in her moment of terror, but in the memory she had shared of the 6 winged moths that filled her homeworld's twilight skies, their bioluminescent patterns telling stories older than her civilization. He meticulously recounted the final, beautiful mathematical proof the Vulpin engineer had been working on, a theory about the harmonic resonance of binary stars that died with her until Elias gave it voice again. He spoke of the Qatari warrior's quiet, personal prayer for his unborn brood mates, a ritual he had performed each morning, and the specific, spicy scent of the incense used in the ceremony. Elias had become a living archive, not of how these beings died, but of how they had lived. His debriefing transcripts, once classified, became the foundational documents for an entirely new field of study, memorial xenohistory. He rejected the notion of being a hero because, in his mind, a hero wins a victory. He saw himself as a witness, the sole bearer of echoes that deserved to be heard not as screams but as songs. His life's purpose crystallized not in the moment he destroyed the beast, but in the years that followed, as he dedicated himself to the painstaking, sacred work of remembrance. He withdrew from public life, surrounding himself with a small team of dedicated linguists, artists, and anthropologists. His home became a museum in progress, a library of the lost. He would spend days working with a skilled holographer, not to recreate the terrifying visage of the void beast, but to meticulously craft the image of the Thelian moths based on the child's memory, ensuring the exact shade of their blue-green light was perfect. He collaborated with composers to translate the Qatari warrior's morning prayer into a musical piece, using the rhythmic cadence of his language and the emotional resonance Elias could still feel when he recalled it. This was his atonement and his gift. He had been forced to use their memories as a weapon to survive. Now, he would use them as a foundation to ensure they endured. The official galactic record had always defined those lost to the Maw as victims of an existential threat, a statistic of cosmic predation. Elias Vance, one quiet, determined man, was determined to redefine them. He would ensure they were remembered not for their fear but for their art, not for their final moments but for their lasting contributions, not as the consumed but as the creators, the thinkers, the lovers, the builders they truly were. In doing so, he forged a new kind of human legacy, one not of conquest but of custody, proving that the most powerful answer to absolute oblivion is not a louder shout, but a more careful, compassionate listening. Years slipped by, turning the event at the Maw from a present-day crisis into a chapter in the history books. The story of Elias Vance and the Odyssey became a foundational myth for a new era, a tale taught to schoolchildren about the quiet strength of the human spirit. Humanity, now firmly established in its role as galactic stewards of psionic resilience, continued its work, developing new technologies and training protocols based on the hard-won principles of mental focus. Yet for all the progress, a certain melancholy lingered in the background, a collective sigh for the incalculable loss that had preceded their salvation. The galaxy felt safer, but also somehow quieter, its chorus of diverse voices forever diminished by the beast's ancient hunger. It was in this atmosphere of settled, solemn remembrance that a discovery was made, one so profound and unexpected that it initially defied belief. A deep space monitoring probe, one of thousands drifting in the lonely stretches between spiral arms, was performing a routine scan of a supposedly empty sector when its long-range array detected an anomaly. It wasn't a natural cosmic phenomenon like a pulsar or a gravitational wave. This was a signal. A structured, coherent, and impossibly complex transmission originating not from a single point, but from a coordinated cluster of 7 distinct star systems, all of which shared one bleak, common characteristic. They were the documented homeworlds of species listed as extinct, their civilizations wiped out by the void beast millennia before anyone had even known its name. The signal itself was not a cry for help or a declaration of war. It was a single, simple word, or rather, the conceptual equivalent of a word repeated in a perfect, synchronized loop. The probe's sophisticated translation matrices, built upon centuries of xenolinguistic research, struggled at first, cross-referencing the patterns against every known language, living and dead. One by one, they identified the components. The first stream was a series of precise, harmonious tonal shifts, a melody that the computer flagged as High Thelian, the formal language of a species that had valued aesthetic perfection above all else. The second was a cascade of intricate mathematical constants, a numerical poem that was the native tongue of the Vulpin. The third was a rhythmic, guttural chant that mirrored the known battle hymns of the Qatari. On and on it went, 7 unique linguistic signatures, 7 voices from beyond the grave, all broadcasting the same core message. The universal translation, after processing the emotional and contextual layers woven into the transmission, rendered the message into a single, powerful concept: gratitude. It was a thank you echoing across the light years. This was not the fading, peaceful dispersal the Odyssey had witnessed. This was something else entirely, a deliberate, focused act of communication. The transmission possessed a strange, layered quality. Beneath the clear semantic meaning of thanks was a deeper, more resonant subtext, a psychic imprint of overwhelming relief and a sense of long-awaited closure. It was as if the collective consciousness of those lost civilizations had, in their final moment of release, pooled the very last dregs of their psionic energy, preserving a fragment of their identity not in a museum of horror, but in a time capsule of appreciation. They had used the last of their unified will to find a way to speak, not of their suffering but of their deliverance. The implications sent xenologists and philosophers into a frenzy. This was more than a ghostly echo, it was a monument. The coordinated nature of the signal emanating from their dead homeworlds suggested a purpose that transcended individual species. It was a galactic headstone inscribed not with names and dates but with a collective cosmic acknowledgement. They were saying that they knew what had been done for them. They were bearing witness to the fact that their story did not end with the beast's consumption, but with a human sacrifice, that their eternal torment had been transformed into eternal peace by the one creature in the universe capable of the quiet, defiant act of remembrance that was Elias Vance's final broadcast. The day the signal was confirmed, the news networks didn't blast it with fanfare or sensationalist graphics. The report was disseminated with a kind of reverent awe, a quiet understanding that this was a moment for reflection, not celebration. On Earth, in the quiet study where an old man now spent his days, a council envoy brought him the data. Elias Vance, his hair white and his hands slightly trembling, listened to the linguistic breakdown and looked at the star chart highlighting the 7 points of light. He did not smile in triumph, he simply closed his eyes and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. It was the final confirmation that his life's work of remembrance had been received. The silent testament from the stars was the ultimate answer to his question, proving that in the vast, cold calculus of the cosmos, even the smallest act of compassion can ripple outward, finding its way home across the ages, a final, gentle whisper from those who are finally, truly free. And so the story of the void beast and its vanquisher settled into the annals of history, a closed chapter of cosmic terror and human triumph. Yet, for a select few, the case was far from closed. Deep within a classified orbital facility, known only as Outpost Theta, a team of the galaxy's most brilliant minds continued their work under a shroud of absolute secrecy. Their mission was not to celebrate the victory, but to understand the enemy. They pored over every fragment of data the Odyssey had captured, from the first ghostly whisper of the maw to the final, dissipating echoes of the liberated souls. They were hunting for answers to questions they dared not ask in public. What was the beast truly? Where did it come from? And in the terrifyingly unlikely event that such an entity could ever exist again, how could it be stopped for good? The atmosphere in the main lab was one of hushed intensity, banks of quantum processors humming as they simulated the impossible physics of the maw's interior. Senior researcher Kale, a stern-faced Vulcan who had lost an entire lineage to the beast, oversaw the project with grim determination. For years, their work had yielded little but confirmation of what they already knew. The entity was gone, its energy signature utterly dissolved. It was a conclusion that offered cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. That is, until a junior xenophysicist, a young human named Aris Thorne, noticed something the complex algorithms had filtered out as background noise. While reviewing the final milliseconds of the psionic shockwave, the one generated by the Sparrow's detonation and the collective release of the archive, Aris saw a glitch. It wasn't a random error. Tucked within the cataclysmic wave of emancipated consciousness was a tiny, coherent data stream, a minuscule knot of energy that had not flown apart with the rest. It was a digital afterimage, a psychic scar on spacetime itself, and it was pulsing with a faint but unmistakable rhythm. At first, he assumed it was an artifact, a reflection of Elias Vance's own neural pattern imprinted on the blast. But the signature was wrong. It was both alien and familiar, a pattern that mirrored the beast's core predatory frequency, but warped, twisted into something entirely new. It was like finding the genetic code of a wolf woven into the gentle, complex song of a forest. He brought his findings to Kale, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and scientific fervor. The Vulcan listened, his expression impassive as Aris explained. This wasn't a lurking predator waiting to reform. The energy signature was inert, non-predatory. It showed none of the aggressive, consumptive hunger that defined the void beast. Instead, it was static, contemplative, almost dormant. It was as if a single cell of the entity had survived the psychic supernova, but in surviving, it had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The immense singular will that had been the beast was gone. In its place was this tiny, lingering echo, and it was broadcasting one thing and one thing only on an endless, silent loop. It was broadcasting a perfect, flawless copy of Elias Vance's final mental state, the profound, weaponized silence he had used to render himself invisible. The beast had not just been defeated, a fragment of it had been inoculated. In its last moment of existence, as it was force-fed the chaotic beauty of 1,000,000,000 lives, the one thing it could not process, the one thing that had broken its system, was the very quiet that had started it all. This echo was not a seed of the old predator. It was the ghost of that final, transformative contradiction. It was a creature of infinite hunger that had, in its death throes, learned the taste of stillness, and a minute piece of that lesson had been seared into the fabric of reality. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and humbling all at once. The void beast was gone, but its encounter with humanity had left a mark upon its very essence. They weren't looking at a threat. They were looking at the first and only known relic of a dead god, a fossil of psionic energy that held the impossible memory of its own defeat, forever imprinted with the quiet human mind that had taught it how to die. Captain Valerius's hand rested on the finished log entry, the cool, smooth surface of the datapad a stark contrast to the turbulent history it now contained. The official record was complete, a dry, factual account of sensor readings, tactical decisions, and casualty reports. Yet, as he gazed out at the serene starfield beyond his viewport, he knew the truth lived not in the data, but in the immense silence that had followed the storm. The story of the Odyssey would be told for generations, a legend of a monster from the void and the crew that outwitted it. But for the captain, the real lesson was far quieter and far more profound. They had faced an enemy against which every conventional advantage was a liability. Superior technology only created more complex systems to fail. Greater psionic power shone like a beacon in the dark, drawing the predator directly to its meal. The very intelligence they prized, the brilliant minds that had built their civilization, had become a death sentence. They had been saved not by meeting force with greater force, but by an act of profound paradox. The ultimate hunter of consciousness was defeated by a conscious decision to become, for a moment, unconscious of self. Elias Vance had not fought the beast with a sharper mind, but with a quieter one. He had not built a stronger shield, but had learned how to stop casting a shadow. In that final, desperate act, he had embodied the one trait the galaxy's most advanced species had overlooked in their relentless pursuit of greater thought, greater power, greater signal. He had demonstrated a capacity for selfless hope. This was not the logical hope of a high probability of success, nor the desperate hope of a last wild gamble. It was the hope that exists in the absolute absence of evidence, the kind of hope that is, in its purest form, an act of faith. It was the hope that by offering up his own mind as a sacrifice, he could create a chance, however infinitesimal, for others to live. He had to hope that the beast would take the bait, that the crew would survive the dampener, that his own identity would not be utterly erased in the process, all while staring into the gullet of a confirmed god of extinction. This willingness to plant a seed in barren soil, to trust in an outcome that every shred of logic declared impossible, was the uniquely human weapon that no database could quantify and no scanner could detect. It was this capacity that allowed a single man to walk into a gallery of genocide and see not a collection of the dead, but a community of the lost worthy of a rescue attempt even from beyond the grave. And so, the official record would state that the void beast was destroyed, but the unofficial truth, the one that would be whispered in the halls of power and studied in the quiet rooms of xenopsychology, was this: the entity was not so much defeated as it was rendered obsolete. It was a predator perfectly evolved for a universe of brilliant, noisy minds, and humanity, introduced a variable its eons of existence had never prepared it for a prey that could choose to be silent, a consciousness that could willingly embrace the void to protect other consciousnesses. The only creature to escape the void beast was human, not because they were faster or stronger or smarter, but because they alone possessed the paradoxical courage to find strength in surrender, and the stubborn, illogical faith to discover a way out by first walking deeper in. The story of the Maw is not just a tale of survival, it is a permanent reminder that in the vast, dark calculus of the cosmos, the most powerful force is not the loudest signal, but the quietest, most resilient heart.